The winter air in the Canadian province was biting, pressing against the windows of our 3-bedroom home. At 19, I thought I had my life figured out, living with Gavin and our 2 beloved pets. Gavin had recently returned from a long work trip, but he wasn't the same man who had left. He seemed lost in another world, unable to finish thoughts or remember simple conversations from minutes prior. Even his mother noticed the change during dinner, her eyes filled with a worry I couldn't yet name. The day of the attack began normally enough with takeout and a quiet evening in the living room. Suddenly, Gavin looked at me and claimed that a former friend had placed a curse on his family. I suggested he take a cold shower to reset, a tactic that had worked for him earlier that week. He walked toward the bathroom muttering to himself, and a heavy sense of dread settled in my stomach. When I asked if I could call his mother, he erupted into a rage, screaming that he only needed me. He emerged from the bathroom naked, his eyes wild as he commanded his guard dog, Ollie, to attack me. I sprinted for the bedroom, clutching my phone as his mother finally answered the line. With a deafening crash, Gavin kicked the bedroom door off its hinges. He grabbed me and slammed my head into the mirrored closet doors, the glass spider webbing behind me. I scrambled away, trying to reach the front door as he screamed that he was going to kill me. In the kitchen, he caught me, wrapping his powerful arms around my throat in a lethal grip. I looked over and saw my cat, Sterling, puffed up and frozen in absolute terror on the table. Black specks began to dance in my vision, and I wondered where he would hide my body once I was gone. He threw me to the floor and hovered his foot over my head as if preparing to stomp it into the ground. Looking into his eyes, I saw nothing but a lifeless, dilated void where the man I loved used to be. I began to apologize for things I hadn't done, saying anything to calm the monster he had become. Seizing a momentary lapse in his focus, I scrambled to my feet and bolted out the front door. I ran through the February snow in nothing but a sweater and shorts, the cold stinging my bare skin. A horrific high-pitched scream from Ollie echoed through the neighborhood, a sound I will never forget. I collapsed on the sidewalk, screaming his name and begging him to leave the dog alone. An older couple from down the street rushed out and pulled me into the safety of their home. I sat on their sofa, shaking violently as I called my mother to tell her what had happened. Within minutes, the quiet street was filled with the flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers. Officers surrounded the house with firearms drawn, their voices booming through megaphones. Gavin finally walked out, naked and covered in a layer of dark, wet blood. An officer approached me later, his face solemn as he asked how many pets lived in the house. He told me that Ollie was dead, found in a bathtub Gavin had filled after the slaughter. I lost all sense of reality, screaming for them to find Sterling, certain he had been killed too. They found him hiding under the bed, terrified and hissing at the officers who tried to help. Walking back into the house to get my cat, the smell of blood and feces was overwhelming. I saw Gavin's mother drop to the ground in the driveway, her wails joining the winter wind. 2 weeks later, Sterling and I were on a plane, leaving the wreckage of my life behind. The justice system failed me, granting Gavin only 10 months of house arrest for the trauma he inflicted. To this day, I carry a heavy weight of self-blame for not seeing the signs sooner. But as I try to heal, I realize that some monsters wear very familiar faces, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The humid night air of Tempe pressed against my skin as I stumbled away from the neon glow of Mill Avenue. My vision swam with the remnants of too many drinks, making the familiar city grid feel like an unsolvable maze. I reached into my pocket only to find my phone was completely dead, leaving me without a map or a lifeline. Driven by a drunkard's confidence, I decided to walk the 7 miles back to my friend's house on foot. The silence of the outskirts was heavy, broken only by the occasional distant siren or the hum of a power line. Suddenly, a low-slung sedan swerved toward the curb, its tires screeching as it blocked my path entirely. The driver's side window rolled down slowly, revealing a large man with a piercing, cold stare. Instead of running, I offered a goofy, intoxicated wave and asked him what was going on. The man looked at me with genuine confusion, as if he couldn't believe my lack of fear. He asked me where I was heading, his voice deep and gravelly against the quiet night. I explained that I was lost and trying to find my way north to a friend's place. After a long pause, he simply grunted and told me to get into the car. Without a second thought, I pulled the door handle and slid into the leather passenger seat. Up close, I noticed he was covered in intricate tattoos and his arm was wrapped in heavy medical bandages. My eyes drifted down to his waistband where the distinct handle of a semi-automatic pistol was tucked. Despite the weapon, I started chatting about the music playing on the radio as if we were old friends. He eventually opened up, telling me he had just been released from the hospital for a gunshot wound. He explained that his girlfriend had just left him because she couldn't handle his life in the gang. Then came the confession. He told me he had been driving around looking for someone to rob before he saw me. I realized in that moment that I had $200 in my wallet and was completely at his mercy. Instead of panic, I told him I was sorry he was going through such a rough time. He shared his dream of becoming a rapper, and I encouraged him to pursue it despite the obstacles. We pulled up to my friend's house, the familiar porch light feeling like a beacon of safety. Feeling a strange sense of gratitude, I invited him inside to hang out with us. My friends were speechless when I walked through the door with the tattooed, armed stranger. The room went silent as the man walked in, his presence dominating the small space. He walked to the bedroom and placed his pistol directly on top of a large metal safe in plain view. It was a clear gesture of peace, a sign that he wasn't there to cause any harm. For the next hour, we all sat in a circle, sharing stories and smoking in the hazy room. The tension vanished, replaced by a bizarre but genuine moment of human connection. He eventually stood up, reclaimed his weapon, and thanked me for the hospitality. I watched from the window as his sedan disappeared into the blackness of the desert night. My friends later pointed out that the safe he left his gun on was filled with thousands in cash. I realize now how easily that night could have ended in a violent tragedy. Sometimes even the people we fear most are just looking for a bit of kindness in a cruel world. But as I drifted to sleep, a new thought began to gnaw at the corners of my mind. I remembered the way he had mentioned he wasn't the only one out that night looking for easy targets. The kindness of one stranger doesn't mean the streets have become any safer. Outside, the wind rattled the window pane, sounding like someone testing the lock. My encounter was a lucky exception, but elsewhere in the darkness, a very different kind of predator was already closing in. My encounter was a lucky exception, but elsewhere in the darkness, a very different kind of predator was already closing in. 10 years have passed since that night, yet the memory of how close I came to dying remains etched into my mind. At the time, I was already building a life with my future husband when I first met his cousin. We bonded over shared struggles, finding common ground in our battles with addiction and eating disorders. Our friendship took a sharp, uncomfortable turn when he suddenly kissed me in his car one evening. Realizing a boundary had been crossed, I decided it was best for both of us to stop speaking entirely. I was honest with my fiancé about the incident, and he was understanding, trusting my judgment. However, I kept the cousin's volatile reaction to the rejection a secret, not wanting to cause a family rift. Months later, we reconnected as friends, but the cycle of starvation we shared felt increasingly toxic. He asked to meet one last time for dinner, and against my better instinct, I agreed. Throughout the meal, he spoke obsessively about a future together, detailing how happy he could make me. Feeling a growing sense of dread, I finally cut him off and asked him to drive me straight home. It was already very late as we walked to his car, the air cold and unyielding. Instead of heading toward my neighborhood, he took a sudden turn toward the local forest preserve. The entrance to the preserve was pitch black, as all the streetlights had been deactivated for the night. We pulled into an isolated parking lot, and the silence of the woods became deafening. He killed the engine, plunging the interior of the vehicle into total darkness. He turned toward me in the seat and whispered that we were destined to be together. I tried to remain calm, reminding him as gently as I could that I was engaged to his cousin. I knew he had a history of violence, and the realization of our isolation began to paralyze me. He began to cry, the sound erratic and high-pitched, before suddenly professing his love again. Without warning, he lunged across the center console and wrapped his thick arm around my throat. He applied massive pressure to the right side of my neck, using his weight to pin me down. My vision began to blur as I stared straight ahead at the dark tree line through the windshield. The world went completely black as I slipped into unconsciousness under the force of his grip. When I finally opened my eyes, a flashlight was beaming through the driver's side window. The officer was knocking on the glass, asking if everyone inside was okay. I realized with a jolt of horror that I had vomited on my shirt and wet my pants while I was out. He quickly told the officer that we were just fine and that I was simply too drunk to stay awake. Terrified that the family would blame me if he were arrested, I remained silent and nodded in agreement. I managed to stutter out that I just wanted to go home immediately, hoping the officer's presence would protect me. The officer took both of our names and issued a ticket, watching us as we prepared to leave. The cousin drove me back in total, suffocating silence, never acknowledging the violence he had just committed. I later learned that the physical reactions I had were signs that I had come within seconds of actual death. I waited a long time to tell my husband the truth, still feeling a misplaced sense of responsibility for what happened. I only saw the cousin a few more times at family holidays where he never dared to speak to me again. If that officer hadn't decided to check that parking lot at that exact minute, I'm certain I wouldn't be here. But while I escaped my predator, others were being hunted by things that defied logic. My brother and I were just children when we saw him, a figure that shouldn't have been human. He was tall, dressed in black, and his jaw hung open in a way that seemed physically impossible. Little did we know this open jaw was just the beginning of a nightmare that would lead us to a warehouse of horrors. The memory of that night is one of those things I completely forgot until a recent phone call with a friend brought it all back with terrifying clarity. Back then, I was only about 7 or 8 years old, and my family had just moved to America, renting the top floor of a typical suburban house. I used to spend every afternoon playing with a set of triplets who lived just a few houses down the street. Every night around 9 or 10, my older brother would make the short 2-minute walk to fetch me and bring me home safely. On this particular night, the sun hadn't fully set, but the shadows were growing long, and the air felt unusually heavy. We started our walk home as normal, but I noticed my brother began casting frequent nervous glances over his shoulder. Suddenly, he shoved me hard away from the sidewalk, pushing me into the narrow gap between 2 neighboring houses. He forced me to crouch down behind a tall wooden fence, his hand pressed firmly against my shoulder to keep me still. I was more bewildered than frightened at first, knowing my brother was a notorious prankster who loved to scare me. He whispered urgently for me to keep quiet and follow him behind the houses because someone was following us. My heart nearly stopped when I finally turned around to see a figure standing near the edge of a fence just a few houses away. The man was dressed in a black hoodie and sweatpants, but it was his face that haunted me. His jaw was hanging wide open in an impossible way. He didn't move or make a sound, he just stood there with that horrifying open jaw staring directly into the shadows where we hid. My brother grabbed my arm and hissed at me to run as fast as I could toward our house. We booked it through the backyards, our feet pounding against the grass, neither of us daring to look back at the monster behind us. We reached the sliding glass door of the bottom unit, and I fumbled with the handle, desperate to get inside the safety of the house. Just as the door slid open, I glanced back and saw the man standing in our yard, just feet away, still wearing that vacant, open-mouthed stare. We scrambled inside and locked the door, immediately running upstairs to tell our mother and sister about the intruder. My mother listened to our story with concern, but since my father was away on a work trip, nothing immediate was done about the man. The next day, we went to meet my dad at his warehouse, a sprawling industrial building where he often worked late into the evening. When we arrived, my dad told us we'd have to wait in the small living area upstairs because the police were busy in the backyard. He led us to the back window and pointed out several officers surrounding a white van parked near the edge of the woods. My dad, who knew nothing of our encounter the night before, mentioned that the police had found a man and a woman inside that van. He looked visibly shaken when he told us the man in the van had his mouth hanging wide open, just like the figure we had seen. He refused to answer any questions about the woman, and to this day, I suspect she may have already been dead when the police arrived. They were arrested for trespassing, but the coincidence of that man appearing at my father's workplace miles away still makes my skin crawl. My brother, now a medical student, insists it was just some drug-induced state or a rare medical condition affecting his facial muscles. But medical explanations don't explain why he was following children through the safest neighborhood in the world or how he found our father. Decades later, the image of that hanging jaw remains the most vivid nightmare of my youth, a reminder that monsters can walk right through the front yard. We moved away shortly after that, but the feeling of being watched never truly left me, especially when walking home at night. Every time I see a figure in a dark hoodie, my mind instantly goes back to that slack-jawed man standing in the shadows of our old fence. The warehouse discovery was the end of that specific story, but for me, the questions of why and how will remain forever unanswered. Sometimes I wonder if the woman in the van was the reason he followed us. Perhaps he was looking for a replacement. The thought alone makes me glad my brother was there that night, his instincts saving us from whatever fate awaited in that white van. It's a chilling reminder that predators don't always look like the monsters we imagine. Sometimes they have a deformity that makes them even more uncanny. I recently found out that the warehouse property was sold years ago, but the local legends of the open jaw still persist among the workers there. There was one detail my brother finally shared. He said the man didn't just have his mouth open, he was making a rhythmic clicking sound with his teeth. That sound, the clicking of bone on bone, is what made him realize this wasn't a joke, but something truly primal and dangerous. Little did we know this open jaw was just the beginning of a nightmare that would lead us to a warehouse of horrors. But as scary as that man was, the real horror was realizing that sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones hiding the darkest secrets in plain sight. But as scary as that man was, the real horror was realizing that sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones hiding the darkest secrets in plain sight. During my freshman year of high school, there was one girl who stood above everyone else in my eyes. Her name was Alyssa, a senior who seemed to radiate a natural, effortless confidence that I could only dream of having. She was smart, stylish, and owned every room she walked into, making her the ultimate role model for a shy girl like me. Back then, I was far too intimidated to even say hello, convinced that someone as ordinary as me would never be noticed by a queen like her. Fast forward to my own senior year, and I found myself in a position I never could have predicted. It began with a small, folded piece of paper that fluttered out of my locker one Tuesday afternoon. I opened it to find a compliment written in neat, simple handwriting. "You were beautiful in that dress on Friday." At the end of the text was a cute little heart, suggesting the presence of a mysterious secret admirer. Over the next few weeks, the notes became a regular occurrence, appearing like clockwork every week or two. I knew this because I had developed a habit of checking my locker both before and immediately after every class. The messages were consistently sweet, telling me that my smile lit up the hallway or that I shone brighter than any star. One note even mentioned my homecoming photos, saying they looked like they were straight out of a magazine cover. The tone was never overtly romantic or aggressive. They felt like something I might have said to Alyssa years ago. I suspected it was just a shy underclassman girl who looked up to me the way I had looked up to my role models. I decided not to tell my friends about the notes, fearing they would turn it into an embarrassing investigation. I genuinely believed that whoever was leaving these messages meant well and was just expressing admiration. During the second semester, everything shifted when my class schedule was restructured. My last class of the day was now upstairs, while my friend's class was conveniently located right near my old locker. We decided to swap lockers for the remainder of the year to make our commutes between classes easier. With the chaos of the new schedule, I completely forgot about the secret admirer notes for several weeks. That all changed on the morning of my 18th birthday when my friend approached me with a smirk. She handed me a new note she had found in her locker, which was my old one that morning. The note simply read, "Happy birthday, princess," and it immediately sent a chill down my spine. My friend explained that she initially thought the previous notes were for her, as the compliments were generic. But since it was my birthday and not hers, we realized the sender hadn't even noticed the locker had changed hands. I finally admitted that these notes had been appearing all year long, much to my friend's astonishment. The investigation I had feared finally began as my friend group transformed into a team of amateur detectives. One friend, who didn't have a fourth period class, volunteered to station herself near the lockers to watch the area. She sat there in the silence of the fourth period, waiting for any movement near my old locker door. Finally, her patience paid off when she spotted someone approaching the lockers with a purposeful stride. It wasn't a shy freshman or a boy from my grade, it was a janitor, an older woman we all recognized. She had been the one slipping the notes through the vents, watching me from the shadows of the school staff for months. The realization that she knew about my field hockey games and even my private Facebook posts made my stomach churn. I remembered seeing her at my last game, sitting completely alone in the far corner of the stands. At the time, I hadn't thought twice about it, but now I knew she had been there specifically to watch me play. We never confronted her, as she hadn't technically broken any laws or threatened me directly. Yet the feeling of being studied by someone invisible for nearly an entire year left a permanent scar on my sense of safety. It made me realize that even the most harmless-seeming gestures can be a mask for something much deeper and more disturbing. But the horror of being watched was nothing compared to the violent stranger waiting on an old highway in the middle of the night. The silence of the rural Midwest was broken only by the aggressive hum of my engine as I fled the city limits. I had just stormed out of my house following an explosive fight with my girlfriend over her loud, intoxicated friends. Heavy metal music blasted through the speakers, a sonic wall intended to drown out my own racing thoughts. I reached for my pack of menthols, chain-smoking one after another to steady my shaking hands. My destination was an old highway that had been largely forgotten since the construction of the interstate. I had been coming to this specific turnoff since my teenage years, seeking solitude or trouble with friends. I pulled into the small lot and was relieved to see that no other cars were parked there. Stepping out of the car, I felt the immediate chill of the night air press against my skin. I sat on the edge of a picnic table, staring up at a sky so clear the stars looked like spilled salt. After several minutes of quiet, I heard a distinct rustling coming from the dense brush behind me. Not wanting to encounter a territorial coyote or a bobcat, I decided it was time to get back inside. Once inside the warmth of my sedan, I turned the music back up and prepared for one final cigarette. Out of nowhere, a violent pounding erupted against the passenger side window. A large, meaty hand was beating rhythmically against the glass with terrifying force. I frantically fumbled with the volume knob, killing the music so I could hear what was happening. A gravelly, furious voice began screaming for me to open the door immediately. The man began yanking on the door handle with such violence that the entire car rocked on its suspension. I thanked God that I had a habit of locking my doors the moment I sat down. The stranger suddenly vanished from the passenger side, leaving only silence for a heartbeat. He reappeared at my driver's side window, his face inches from the glass as he cursed at me. He began punching the window with his bare fists, clearly trying to shatter the tempered glass. For a few seconds I was paralyzed by a mix of confusion and animalistic fear. Adrenaline finally kicked in, and I threw the car into reverse with a mechanical lurch. In that split second, my headlights illuminated him as he stumbled back from the moving vehicle. He was a stocky man, well over 6 feet tall, towering over the frame of my small sedan. The most distinctive feature I saw was a massive, dark beard that obscured the lower half of his face. I floored the accelerator, sending gravel spraying in every direction as I pivoted toward the exit. As I sped away, a deafening bang echoed through the trees, sounding exactly like a gunshot. I didn't look back, my only instinct being to put as much distance between us as possible. I realized I was doing 90 miles per hour on a narrow gravel road, but I didn't slow down. I drove straight to a nearby gas station where one of my best friends was working the night shift. My heart was still hammering against my ribs as I spilled the entire story to him. We went back out to the car with a flashlight to inspect the damage. We found several fresh dents on the roof and a muddy boot print stamped into the passenger door. I had no idea what that man's intentions were: robbery, carjacking, or something much darker. We decided not to call the police, assuming he would be long gone before they ever reached the clearing. To this day, I still can't drive down that old highway without checking my rearview mirror every 10 seconds. Some people go to the woods to find themselves, but I only found a reason to never return. I thought the stranger on the highway was the only monster I would encounter in my life. But a far more calculated evil was hiding in plain sight within the circle of my closest friends. For over 20 years, John was more than just a friend. He was the brother my husband never had. We met in elementary school, an inseparable trio that bonded over vintage board games and the shared language of computer code. John had a remarkably docile nature, the kind of wholesome character who made everyone in the room feel immediately safe. Even as the years marched on and our lives evolved into marriage and careers, John remained a constant, steady presence. The only oddity was his complete lack of a romantic life. In 2 decades, we never saw him so much as go on a single date. Everything began to shift the day he announced a sudden move to a town 3 hours away, settling into his sister's secluded retirement home. Slowly, John fell off the map entirely, ignoring calls and disappearing from the social circles he once cherished. Worried that the distance was killing the friendship, I insisted we drive out to visit his new life in the country. The house was situated in a desolate, overgrown neighborhood that felt more like a hiding place than a home. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with neglect, the air heavy with the smell of stale food and unwashed clothes. John's bedroom was a shocking time capsule, decorated exactly like a teenager's room with wires and hardware strewn across the floor. When I asked why he had stopped calling, he offered short, scripted answers that felt like they had been rehearsed 1,000 times. He claimed he was just busy, but his eyes lacked the warmth we had known for 2 decades. We left feeling unsettled, as if the person we had spent the afternoon with was merely a hollow shell of our friend. Months later, I noticed a bizarre pattern on his public social media profile. He was leaving obsessive comments on Nickelodeon posts written in a childish tone that felt disturbingly out of place for a man in his late 30s. I tried to convince myself it was just an innocent, eccentric hobby, but the nagging feeling in my gut only grew stronger. On a final attempt to reconnect, I called him, only to find his voice strained and evasive, pleading that he wasn't settled yet. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening when my husband screamed for me to come downstairs to the television. My husband was white as a sheet, his hand trembling as he pointed the remote at a local news segment. There on the screen was John, being led into a courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, his hands and feet bound in heavy iron shackles. The headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen shattered our world. Local man arrested in international child trafficking ring. The reporter explained that he was a key figure in a dark web network that had been under investigation for years. Police had raided his sister's house and his mother's home, uncovering hundreds of horrific files hidden deep within his encrypted drives. There was even a DNA match, a detail so grim that we didn't dare to ask what it truly implied. John was sentenced to over 30 years in prison, ensuring he would be an old man before he ever saw the sun as a free person again. His family immediately disowned him, scrubbing his name from their property and every trace of his existence from their lives. We did the same, deleting his number and burning the photos of the man we thought we knew. The betrayal broke something fundamental in my husband, leaving him deeply distrustful of everyone he meets. We realized that the gentle, wholesome guy who had slept in our guest room was nothing more than a masterfully crafted illusion. It is a terrifying realization that you can spend 20 years with a person and never truly see the monster hiding behind their eyes. The true horror isn't the stranger in the woods, but the best friend sitting right beside you at the dinner table. In the years since, we have slowly rebuilt our lives, learning to find safety in the small, honest moments we share with each other. We have learned that while evil can wear a familiar face, the light of truth will always eventually tear the mask away. Though the scars of John's deception remain, they serve as a reminder to cherish the genuine souls who stay in the light. We choose now to live without fear, knowing that the strength we found in the aftermath is something no monster can ever take. Our story is one of survival, not just of the body, but of the spirit's ability to heal after total betrayal. As the shadows of the past finally recede, we look toward a future where trust is earned and truth is the only foundation. The monsters may live among us, but they will never truly win as long as we keep the light of our humanity burning bright. Sleep soundly tonight, for the truth has been spoken and the shadows have finally been laid to rest.